Every story has a villain, but not every villain is simple. Welcome to Dark Character Profiler, the podcast where we examine fictional characters through psychology, trauma, and moral fracture. Here, we go beyond good and evil to ask harder questions. What shaped them? What broke them? And at what point does survival become monstrosity? I'm your host, Fulcrum. Let's begin.
Dark Character Profile.
Listener discretion is advised. This episode includes discussions of severe psychological trauma, violence, abuse, and exploitation. All analysis is presented for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional diagnosis, psychological treatment, or medical advice. The material is examined analytically and without glorification, but it may still be distressing. If you need to pause, skip, or step away, please do so.
Dark Character Profile.
The first thing that strikes me when I look at Dutch van der Linde's story isn't the violence. It's the conviction, the certainty in his voice, the ease with which people listen. The way men follow him into the wilderness, not because they're afraid, but because they believe. Dutch doesn't begin as a criminal mastermind or a tyrant. He begins as an idea that the world is cruel, rigged, and dishonest, and that freedom belongs to those bold enough to take it. An idea that civilization is a lie, that authority is corruption dressed in law, and that loyalty is the only truth that matters. For a long time, Dutch sounds right. That's what makes his case so dangerous. Because when a man believes he's righteous, he doesn't hear warnings, he hears challenges. And every challenge becomes proof that the world is exactly as broken as he said it was. Dutch's story is not the fall of a villain who lost his way. It's the collapse of a belief system under the weight of reality. A slow unraveling where ideals are forced to confront consequences, and where a man who once preached freedom begins to confuse control with loyalty, obedience with truth, and fear with respect. Tonight, I'm opening Dutch van der Linde's file to understand what happens when a charismatic leader mistakes his philosophy for destiny, and why, when the world finally refuses to bend to his vision, he chooses to burn everything that proved him wrong. Background information. Dutch van der Linde does not come from nothing. He comes from rejection, a world that discarded him early, a society that taught him power belonged to the wealthy, the connected, and the cruel, a system he decided he would never kneel to. Dutch is intelligent, articulate, widely read, and deeply ideological. He doesn't just steal, he explains. He doesn't just kill, he rationalizes. He frames his life not as crime, but as resistance. And for years, he makes that framing believable. The gang isn't just a group of outlaws. It's a family, a refuge for the lost, the broken, the unwanted. Men and women who failed to fit into a world that offered them no mercy. Dutch becomes their center of gravity. He gives them meaning. He gives them language. He gives them the sense that suffering has a purpose. But beneath the speeches and the principles is a quieter truth. Dutch needs to be believed, not admired, believed. Because belief gives him identity. It gives him authority. It gives him proof that his way of living isn't just survival, it's superior. As the world modernizes and closes in, Dutch doesn't adapt. He doubles down. Every failed plan is blamed on betrayal. Every consequence is reframed as oppression. Every loss is someone else's fault. The dream never shrinks. Reality does. And in that tightening space, Dutch begins to confuse the gang's survival with his own relevance. Trauma history. Dutch's trauma is not a single defining moment. It's a philosophy forged in opposition. He is shaped by chronic marginalization, by the erosion of autonomy, by watching the frontier die while institutions grow stronger. The world he built his identity around is disappearing, and with it, the version of himself that made sense. That loss is traumatic, not because it's violent, but because it's existential. Dutch experiences identity threat as civilization advances, chronic stress from prolonged evasion and failure, repeated moral injuries as his ideals conflict with survival, betrayal sensitivity rooted in fear of abandonment, and narcissistic injury when authority challenges his self-image. As pressure mounts, Dutch becomes increasingly rigid. Flexibility feels like surrender. Compromise feels like betrayal. Every death under his leadership leaves a mark, but instead of grief, it produces defensiveness. Instead of reflection, justification. Trauma doesn't humble Dutch, it radicalizes him. The more the world proves him wrong, the more violently he insists he was right all along. By the time the cracks are visible to everyone else, Dutch is no longer protecting a family. He's protecting an identity that cannot survive reality. And once that happens, anyone who threatens the idea of Dutch van der Linde becomes an enemy, even the people who loved him most. Mental state. When I picture Dutch van der Linde during the middle of his arc, the stretch where his ideals are still intact but reality has begun to resist them, I see a man standing at the center of a campfire circle, speaking with absolute certainty while the world quietly shifts out of alignment around him. Dutch is not mentally unstable in the way people often suggest. He isn't incoherent. He isn't detached from reality. He isn't confused. He's convinced. Dutch's mental state is defined by ideological rigidity paired with narcissistic vulnerability. His sense of self is fused to his belief system, which means questioning his ideas feels identical to questioning his worth. He does not adapt his worldview in response to failure. He reframes failure as proof of persecution. This creates a closed psychological loop. If the plan works, Dutch was right. If the plan fails, the world interfered. If someone questions him, they are weak, corrupted, or disloyal. Doubt doesn't enter Dutch's mind as curiosity. It enters as threat. As pressure mounts, Dutch becomes increasingly reliant on external validation, loyalty, obedience, affirmation to stabilize his internal state. The more unstable the world becomes, the more absolute his leadership needs to be. What makes Dutch psychologically dangerous is that he genuinely believes he is protecting others. His manipulation is not cynical at first. It is paternal, missionary, righteous. Over time, however, the distinction between belief and identity collapses. Dutch no longer asks, "Is this right?" He asks, "Does this preserve the idea of me?" By the time the gang begins to fracture, Dutch isn't losing his mind. He's losing the ability to tolerate any version of reality that contradicts his self-concept. Fulcrum's personality breakdown, the hurricane scale. Before analyzing Dutch's personality trait, it's important to frame his emotional climate. Category 1 starts as subtle wins and manageable emotions, all the way through Category 5, which is total internal upheaval. Dutch's emotional weather begins as a steady, persuasive wind and escalates into a storm driven by ego, fear, and ideological collapse. Here's how Dutch van der Linde registers on the hurricane scale. Imagination and insight. Category 4. Dutch is imaginative, articulate, and philosophically inclined. He sees himself not just as a leader, but as a thinker. He understands people well enough to inspire them. He understands systems well enough to resist them. But his insight is selective. He can read others, but he struggles to read himself. Dutch imagines grand futures. One last score, one final escape, one clean break from the world he despises. What he cannot imagine is a future where he is wrong. That blind spot makes his insight powerful and catastrophic. Control and order. Category 5. Control is Dutch's anchor. As law, industry, and civilization tighten their grip on the frontier, Dutch experiences this as a direct assault on his identity. He responds not by adapting, but by asserting dominance. Plans become proclamations, suggestions become orders, dissent becomes betrayal. When Dutch feels control slipping, he does not pause, he escalates. This is the core of his hurricane: the need to remain unquestioned, the need to remain central, the need to remain right. Social energy, category 4. Dutch is socially active by necessity, not preference. He thrives in the role of speaker, leader, and symbolic father figure. He is not seeking intimacy, he seeks influence. Early on, he uses social energy to build cohesion and morale. Later, that same energy becomes performative, a tool to reassert authority and silence doubt. As the gang fractures, Dutch speaks more, but listens less. Compassion and cooperation. Category 3 to Category 1. Dutch begins with genuine concern for his people. He rescues the lost. He protects the vulnerable, speaks of loyalty and shared fate, but compassion becomes conditional. If someone aligns with Dutch's vision, they are family. If they question it, they become expendable. By the end, compassion is no longer a guiding force. It exists only when it reinforces obedience. The values never disappear, they are overridden. Unpredictability, Category 4 to Category 5. Dutch's unpredictability emerges through ideological drift. Each loss pushes him further from restraint. Each challenge accelerates his willingness to gamble lives. Each betrayal, real or imagined, widens the scope of acceptable violence. Dutch becomes unpredictable not because he is impulsive, but because his decision-making is now filtered through paranoia and wounded pride. The only thing that remains consistent is this: Dutch will always choose the path that preserves his authority, even if it destroys everything he once claimed to stand for. Moral beliefs. Dutch van der Linde's moral code is not absent, it is ideological. From the beginning, Dutch frames himself as a principled man resisting an unjust world. He does not see himself as a criminal. He sees himself as a philosopher in opposition, someone who understands the lie at the heart of civilization and refuses to participate in it. Freedom, loyalty, self-determination, resistance to authority. These are not excuses at first. They are sincerely held beliefs. But Dutch's morality is not anchored to compassion. It is anchored to identity. As the world changes and his plans begin to fail, Dutch's moral system adapts, not toward reflection, but toward self-preservation. Authority becomes tyranny, law becomes oppression, consequences become persecution, dissent becomes betrayal. Every moral adjustment serves one purpose: to keep Dutch right. He does not abandon his values, he weaponizes them. Violence becomes necessary restraint. Manipulation becomes leadership. Sacrifice becomes proof of loyalty. Death becomes collateral in the service of a greater truth. The ideology that once bound the gang together becomes a tool of control. Dutch does not ask, "Is this just?" He asks, "Does this serve the idea I represent?" When his people begin to suffer under his decisions, Dutch does not revise his beliefs. He revises his definition of who deserves protection. By the end, Dutch is not immoral. He is morally insulated, a man whose beliefs bend flawlessly around whatever keeps him in power. Relationships. Dutch's relationships are not peripheral to his psychology. They are his psychology. Every major relationship reflects a different facet of who Dutch believes himself to be and who he refuses to become. Arthur Morgan. Arthur is Dutch's mirror and his quiet conscience. Arthur believes in Dutch long after the evidence begins to erode. He embodies the version of Dutch's philosophy that still includes compassion, restraint, and loyalty without condition. And that is precisely why Arthur becomes dangerous to him. As Arthur begins to question the cost of Dutch's decisions, Dutch does not hear concern, he hears judgment. Arthur represents the version of Dutch that might have adapted, softened, or stepped aside. And Dutch cannot tolerate that reflection. Their bond fractures not because Arthur betrays him, but because Arthur sees him. And Dutch cannot survive being seen without control. John Marston. If Arthur is the conscience, John is the future Dutch failed to protect. John represents survival beyond ideology. A man who wants out, a man who wants peace, a man who values family over philosophy. Dutch alternates between protecting John and resenting him. John's desire for a different life threatens Dutch's narrative that there is no alternative. When Dutch abandons John, it is not indifference. It is rejection of a future that proves Dutch's worldview obsolete. Hosea Matthews. Hosea is Dutch's restraint, the voice of caution, the counterweight, the reminder that ideals without limits become cruelty. Hosea questions Dutch not to undermine him, but to protect him and the people who follow him. When Hosea dies, Dutch loses the last external check on his ego, and instead of mourning, he radicalizes. The loss does not humble him, it frees him from contradiction. Micah Bell. Micah is not Dutch's corruptor. He is Dutch's permission. Micah reflects the version of Dutch that values dominance over loyalty, fear over respect, survival over ideals. Where others challenge Dutch's excesses, Micah validates them. Micah never asks Dutch to be better. He asks him to be more. And Dutch, exhausted by doubt and threatened by dissent, listens. Micah does not change Dutch. He amplifies what was already there, the belief that power justifies itself. Historical parallels. Dutch van der Linde's psychological arc closely mirrors several real-world figures whose leadership collapsed under the weight of ideology, ego, and an inability to adapt. Jim Jones. Jones began as a charismatic idealist focused on equality and community. Over time, his ideology hardened. Dissent became betrayal, and loyalty became absolute. Like Dutch, Jones reframed opposition as persecution and demanded obedience in the name of protection. Both men mistook control for care and destroyed their communities while insisting they were saving them. Maximilien de Robespierre. Robespierre believed virtue justified terror. He also saw himself as the moral center of a corrupt system and viewed dissent as moral failure. Dutch mirrors this trajectory. Principles elevated to absolutes, violence reframed as necessity, and leadership transformed into ideological enforcement. Both men became prisoners of their own righteousness. Fidel Castro. Castro began as a revolutionary promising freedom and reform. Over time, power consolidated, dissent vanished, and ideology became justification for control. Dutch shares this pattern. Liberation rhetoric paired with increasing authoritarian behavior, all framed as necessary resistance to oppression. Charles Manson, not for scale or crime, but for psychological structure. Manson fused identity, ideology, and obedience. He reframed violence as destiny and positioned himself as the sole interpreter of the truth. Dutch similarly binds belief to loyalty, creating a closed system where disagreement becomes moral failure. And finally, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon began as a revolutionary hero and ended as an emperor unable to accept limits. Like Dutch, his ambition outpaced reality. Each loss demanded escalation. Each challenge reinforced his belief that history owed him victory. Both men fell not because they lacked vision, but because they could not tolerate constraint.
And now, the final analysis. But first, just a little house cleaning.
Before we examine the crimes and potential diagnoses, a brief reminder. This analysis is presented for educational and entertainment purposes only.
Dark character profile.
Criminal behavior. Dutch van der Linde's criminal behavior does not begin as domination. It begins as ideology in action. Early in his life, Dutch frames crime as resistance against governments, banks, industries, and the slow suffocation of individual freedom. Theft is not greed, it is retribution. Violence is not cruelty, it is defense. Killing is framed as tragic but necessary in a world that refuses to leave him alone. For a time, this framing works, both for him and for those who follow him. But ideology has a fault line. When it stops serving people, it starts serving itself. Dutch's criminal behavior escalates in 3 distinct phases. Phase 1, survival crime. In the earliest phase, Dutch's crimes are communal. Robberies are designed to feed the gang. Violence is reactive rather than expressive. Loss of life is treated as a cost, not a goal. Dutch still listens, still weighs Hosea's caution, still reacts emotionally to deaths under his leadership. There is moral tension here. There are limits. There is a sense, however fragile, that lines still exist. Phase 2, strategic crime. As law enforcement pressure increases and plans begin to fail, Dutch shifts. Crime becomes less about survival and more about leverage. At this stage, Dutch accepts higher civilian risk, uses violence as deterrence and messaging, frames reckless paths as tests of loyalty, allows expendable losses to preserve authority, and begins isolating dissenters through danger rather than dialogue. The ideology remains, but it narrows. The gang's safety becomes secondary to the plan. The plan becomes secondary to Dutch being right. Phase 3, ideological crime. In the final phase, crime is no longer instrumental. It is expressive. Dutch no longer reacts to threats. He asserts dominance over them. Violence becomes symbolic. Death becomes narrative control. He adopts the behavioral patterns of authoritarian leadership. loyalty tests, punitive abandonment, fear-based compliance, strategic executions, and reality reframing as persecution. Dutch never stops calling himself a freedom fighter. Even when his actions mirror the tyranny he claims to oppose, he insists the world forced his hand. But the truth is simpler. Dutch did not lose his way. He followed his beliefs to their most extreme conclusion. Psychological testing. If Dutch van der Linde underwent modern psychological testing, the results would reflect a mind shaped by ideology, narcissistic injury, and progressive identity collapse, not impulsive criminality. Trauma and stress response. High. Dutch shows chronic stress responses tied to loss of autonomy, repeated failure under pressure, erosion of identity as the frontier disappears, moral injury from deaths under his command, and persistent threat to relevance. Under stress, Dutch becomes rigid rather than reflective. Flexibility feels like surrender. Impulsivity, low to moderate. Context dependent. Dutch is generally strategic and deliberate. However, under ego threat, impulse control degrades. Risk-taking increases when authority is questioned, loyalty wavers, and his ideology is challenged. This is ego-driven impulsivity, not baseline recklessness. Empathy, conditionally preserved. Dutch demonstrates real empathy early in life. He rescues outsiders and protects the vulnerable. Over time, empathy becomes conditional, present for believers, absent for dissenters. Eventually, people matter only insofar as they support the idea Dutch represents. Moral reasoning, ideologically filtered. Dutch does not lack morals. He filters them through belief. Harm becomes acceptable if framed as resistance. Loss becomes acceptable if framed as sacrifice. Cruelty becomes invisible when wrapped in rhetoric. Grandiosity, progressive. Testing would reveal belief in personal destiny, moral and intellectual superiority, entitlement to leadership, hypersensitivity to disrespect, and externalization of blame. Dutch believes history needs him and treats contradiction as corruption. Identity stability, severely disrupted. Dutch's identity is fused to his ideology. As the ideology fails, his sense of self fragments. Indicators include defensive rigidity, paranoia under stress, role entrenchment, dissociation from consequences, and increasing detachment from reality. Without belief, Dutch does not know who he is. Diagnostic breakdown. This is the full clinical breakdown of each diagnosis, showing required criteria, symptoms Dutch meets, and how he meets them. First, we have narcissistic personality disorder, traits present, DSM-5 requirements, a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy, beginning in early adulthood with 5 or more criteria required. Dutch only meets 4. Criterion 1, grandiose sense of self-importance. Dutch views himself as a philosopher leader whose vision supersedes law, morality, and consequence. Criterion 2, preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success or power. He fixates on one last score, total freedom, and a future where his ideology triumphs. Criterion 3, belief he is special or unique. Dutch consistently frames himself as misunderstood by ordinary society and morally superior to it. And finally, criteria 4 requires excessive admiration. Loyalty and belief from the gang are necessary to stabilize his self-image. Conclusion: Dutch exhibits narcissistic personality features, but does not fully meet criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, resulting in a diagnosis of narcissistic personality traits subclinical. Delusional disorder, grandiose type, late stage. DSM-5 TR requirements: presence of one or more delusions for at least 1 month without marked functional impairment outside the delusional belief. Grandiose delusions. Dutch believes he is historically necessary, morally correct, and persecuted for truth. Preserved functioning outside belief system. He remains articulate, strategic, and organized. The delusion is ideological, not chaotic. Reality distortion without hallucinations. Dutch reframes evidence to protect belief, not through psychosis, but conviction. Diagnosis: delusional disorder, grandiose type, late stage. Major depressive disorder, persistent depressive features. Dutch exhibits hopelessness, loss of future orientation, emotional exhaustion, irritability, and fatalism. Symptoms persist beneath ideology but are masked by control and rhetoric. Diagnosis: persistent depressive features, subthreshold for major depressive disorder. Finally, we have moral injury. Dutch repeatedly violates his stated values: loyalty, protection, freedom. Instead of reconciling this, he reframes reality to preserve identity. The injury accumulates, ideology becomes scar tissue. Thus, moral injury is applied as a clinical conceptualization. Final impressions. When I close Dutch van der Linde's file, what lingers isn't the bloodshed or the speeches or even the betrayal. It's the certainty. The certainty of a man who believed so completely in his own vision that reality itself became negotiable. The certainty that allowed him to call control freedom, obedience loyalty, and fear faith. Dutch did not become dangerous because he lost his morals. He became dangerous because he refused to let them change. For a long time, Dutch offered people meaning. He gave the lost a family. He gave the hunted a cause. He gave the frightened a story in which their suffering mattered. And that is what makes his collapse so devastating. When the world evolved beyond his philosophy, Dutch did not adapt. He doubled down. When people questioned him, he did not listen. He tested them. When reality contradicted him, he did not reflect. He reframed. In the end, Dutch van der Linde is not a villain driven by greed or madness. He is a man who mistook belief for truth and leadership for destiny. A man who could not survive a world where he was no longer right. And so he chose destruction, not because he wanted chaos, but because chaos was the last place his ideology could still breathe. Dutch didn't fall because he lacked conviction. He fell because conviction became more important than the people who believed in him. And once belief mattered more than lives, there was nothing left to save.
Dark Character Profiler.
Dark Character Profiler is produced and edited by Fulcrum under Dark Fulcrum Media. If you enjoyed this episode, consider following the show or sharing it with someone who loves psychology, storytelling, and morally complex characters. You can find links, references, and related material in the show notes. Until next time, remember, the most terrifying monsters are rarely born. They're shaped.
thank you for listening to Dark Character Profiler with Fulcrum. Listen every other Tuesday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Podcasts. Humanity was not meant to live this way. Society is left to the mercy of murderers and cutthroats. Hear Paige Zaplin Dam's epic tale brought to life in an audiobook.
For years, Slade had felt secure in the forest.
I am from simple, humble beginnings. I was raised in the Ironwood by an ogress, an Anaral.
He saw immediately that she was beyond a healer's aid. Even a skilled witch could not help her recover from losing so much blood. Mother?
Slade thought he wanted revenge. Instead, he got redemption. A kingdom of ash and steam, The Ogress's Son, a dystopian neo-dark age fantasy, narrated by Rich Frazier. Now available on iTunes and Audible.
I promise you I will find whoever did this and avenge you, Mother.